Tamanna. Tamanna Vale.
Good afternoon, esteemed guests and judges. My name is Tamanna, and today I'll be talking about the importance of historical preservation. What exactly is historical preservation? Well, historical preservation is the act of preserving the historical monuments and artifacts. Simply, it is when someone preserves an old artifact or monument by putting it in a museum, rebuilding or restoring that artifact, or just stories that get passed down by families. Preserving our history, culture, and historical identity connects us to our past, helps us learn from old mistakes, and educates the future generations not to make the same mistakes. Canada has a very dominant narrative of history. What I mean is that Canada's history has shown its positives compared to its negatives. There have been many times in history where people would say that Canada's history has been positive, welcoming, and kind, when we all know that is not true. From residential schools to internment camps to even harmful immigration laws in the past, Canada's history has not been that great. Which brings me to my next point, which is Canada's heritage, buildings, and sites. The parks of Canada are responsible for over 100 parks throughout the country. From forts to Niagara to even pioneer homes near us, Canada is responsible for keeping them safe and preserved. My favorite example of this is when I visited the Fort Langley in British Columbia. It was an old trading post that was owned by the Hudson Bay Company, which traded with the First Nation groups in that area. Upon visiting, I learned many interesting things, from trade routes to the gold rush to even the indigenous groups of that area. I felt educated, which should be the main goal of these historic sites. Many sites can be reused and repurposed for cost-saving measures and less energy consumption. For example, the John Street Roadhouse in Toronto. It was an old train repair facility that was owned by the Canadian Pacific Rail, now turned into a commercial and residential use building. This way we can preserve the old building, but also let future generations use it for their own purposes. This is a good example of preserving and reusing historic sites and educating people about Canada's history. This brings me to my next point, which is the importance of museum funding. Did you know that the museums in Ontario fund almost $1.8 billion in total economic benefits annually, according to the Ontario Museum Association? Museums are like a library, where curators store these important artifacts for the public to enjoy and educate themselves with. Museums link us to a past physically with these artifacts. It also shows past civilizations and societies that we can appreciate and learn from. Many artifacts are preserved and stored safely, which shows another great example of why historic preservation is important. One drawback of museums, though, is admission fees. This is why we should give importance to museum funding, so museums could be free and also the public can enjoy them without worrying about paying a ticket. Next, I'd like to connect preservation to cultural identity. Defined by the Oxford Reference as cultural identity is the definition of groups or individuals in terms of cultural or subcultural categories. Cultural identity is one's story, one's personality. It is their family. It what makes a person. Cultural identity is shown that to connect historical preservation with cultural identity, it is shown that preserving our history equals to preserving our identity. History is connected with people and how they live. Thus, preserving our history and culture helps the younger generation learn how their people and their ancestors lived. One great example of preserving cultural history is through stories that were passed down by families. These families have a very strong story, and because of its old age, it is considered history to them. Thus, preserving our history helps preserve our cultural identity as well. To continue, I'd like to shed light on new archaeological findings that happened in 2023. About 120 new archaeological findings were documented in 2023 alone, and these are from art history to even burial sites. These findings are crucial to the archaeological world because it shows us that there is still more history to be discovered. My favorite ones from 2023 were the lost Maya city discovered in the Mexican jungle and the lost Roman forts that were discovered using Cold War spy satellites. If you haven't gotten the point that historical identity and historical preservation is important, let me summarize it. Preserving our history teaches us about our past, our culture, our society, and most especially ourselves. It teaches us and our future generations not to make the same mistakes, but instead to learn from them. It teaches us and our future generations that historic preservation can be as big as Canada's historic sites or as small as family heirlooms, and stories. Thus, we should give importance to new findings and data to ensure it's protected for us to learn and remember. Our history is put in textbooks and taught to us for a reason, and that reason is for us to be educated and to understand our past. Whether it is to be proud or disappointed, it is our duty in society to preserve it and make sure that the future generation have them for their own research and education. Just like Maya Angelou once said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be outlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. My name is Tamanna, and thank you for listening to me.